When my uncle died, we expected nothing but old tools, boxes of yellowed papers and dust. He had lived quiet, almost invisible, a man with no wife, no children, no reason to keep secrets. But in the basement, behind a false wall, we found it. A container of stainless steel, sealed tight, heavy enough to crack the concrete beneath it. Stamped across the lid was NASA's insignia, and markings I had never seen before, the kind that didn't look like warnings so much as curses. The air around it felt colder, pressing down on us, heavy in the lungs. We brushed the dust away and saw words carved deep into the metal, not by machine but by hand, jagged and trembling. Do not open until the end. At first we laughed, called it an old prank, some government junk he'd stolen decades ago. But when my hand touched the lid, the steel wasn't cold, it was warm. And beneath that warmth, something shifted inside. That night I dreamed of stars I had never seen, moons shattered into dust, oceans boiling black. And in the dream, a voice whispered the same words carved on the box. Do not open until the end. I woke up with blood on my pillow and bruises around my wrists, as if something had held me down. The container in the basement was humming, faint and steady, like a heartbeat waiting for its moment. My uncle had been guarding it, hiding it, dying with it, and now it was mine. Whatever was inside, it wasn't meant to be opened by us. It was meant to be found after humanity was already gone. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to go back down there. The basement felt different now, like stepping into a cathedral built for the wrong god. My cousin Jake had driven down from Portland to help sort through Uncle Raymond's things, but he wouldn't go near the container, said it made his fillings hurt. Tommy, this is fucked up, he muttered, chain-smoking Marlboros by the basement stairs. Ray never told us about any NASA shit. Guy worked at the goddamn post office for 30 years. But that wasn't entirely true. I remembered fragments now, whispered conversations at family gatherings when Jake and I were kids. Uncle Raymond had worked somewhere else before the postal service. Something about satellites. Something about watching the sky. The container had 17 separate locking mechanisms. Not padlocks or combination locks, but something that looked almost biological. Metal that curved and twisted like bone, like the locks themselves were alive. When I ran my finger along one of them, it pulsed. Warm, waiting. The humming grew louder each night. By the 4th day, I could hear it upstairs. A low frequency that made the windows vibrate and turned milk sour in the refrigerator. Jake left that morning, said he couldn't take it anymore, said the sound was following him into his dreams. I should have gone with him, should have walked away from that house in Klamath Falls and never looked back. Instead, I stayed, because something in those 17 locks was calling my name. The first lock opened 3 days after Jake left. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even been in the basement that morning. I was upstairs making breakfast when I heard the sound. A wet clicking, like joints popping underwater. By the time I reached the basement stairs, the humming had changed pitch, higher now, almost musical. One of the 17 locks hung open, its metal surface slick with something that looked like condensation, but felt warm between my fingers. The substance had no smell, but when I rubbed it off on my jeans, the fabric started to fade where it touched. Uncle Raymond's house sat on 3 acres outside Klamath Falls, backed up against Bureau of Land Management property that stretched for miles. No neighbours close enough to hear anything, no one to call if things went sideways. The isolation had felt peaceful when I was a kid visiting for summers. Now it felt like a trap. I called Jake that night, got his voicemail, called again an hour later. Same thing. Look, something's happening with that container, I said to the recording. One of the locks opened by itself. I know how that sounds, but I need you to call me back, please. He never did. The second lock opened while I was sleeping. I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking, but when I sat up, nothing was there. Just the hallway, dark and empty, and that humming climbing another octave. This time when I went downstairs, I found scratches in the concrete around the container. Fresh gouges, as if something inside had been clawing at the walls. I should have called the police, should have called the fire department, hell, should have called NASA themselves. But what would I tell them? That my dead uncle had a singing box in his basement that was opening itself. That I was losing my shit in a house that smelled like dust and old cigarettes. Instead, I drove into town and bought a digital camera. If this thing was going to do something, I wanted proof. Klamath Falls had always been a quiet place, railroad town, logging town, the kind of place where people minded their own business and asked few questions. But at Murphy's Hardware, old Pete Murphy kept staring at me while I browsed the electronics aisle. "You Ray's nephew," he said, not a question. "Yeah, Tommy. Heard you've been staying out at his place." Pete leaned against the counter, his weathered hands drumming against the wood. "Neighbors been talking. Say there's been strange sounds coming from that direction." "What kind of sounds?" Pete's eyes narrowed. "The kind that make dogs hide under porches. The kind that send the deer running to higher ground." He paused, studying my face. "Your uncle ever tell you what he did before the post office?" "Something with satellites, I think." "Satellites?" Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ray worked for NASA, all right, but not satellites. Deep space monitoring. Used to come in here buying supplies for all kinds of weird projects. Radio equipment, lead sheeting, magnetic shielding. Said he was building a workshop, but we all knew better." "Better how?" "Ray was listening for something. Something he hoped would never find us." That night, I set up the camera in the basement, pointed it at the container. The humming had grown strong enough that it made my vision blur if I stayed down there too long. The air felt thick, almost viscous, like breathing through honey. The third lock opened at 3:17 a.m. I watched it happen on the camera's display screen, huddled in Uncle Raymond's old recliner upstairs. The metal twisted and curled like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing mechanisms underneath that definitely weren't made by human hands. They moved with purpose, with intelligence, but it was what happened next that made me realize I was in deep shit. The scratches in the concrete began to form patterns, not random gouges, but symbols, mathematical equations that hurt to look at directly, formulas that seemed to twist and writhe when I tried to focus on them through the camera screen. And beneath it all, carved deeper than the rest, words in English. "We tried to warn you." I recognized the handwriting. The same shaky letters that had carved, "Do not open until the end," into the container's lid. Uncle Raymond's handwriting. By morning, 5 more locks had opened. The humming had become a song, something with rhythm and melody that reminded me of hymns played backwards. The basement temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and frost was forming on the concrete walls despite the Oregon heat outside. I found Uncle Raymond's journal that day, hidden behind a loose board in his bedroom closet. The entries went back 40 years, starting with his recruitment to NASA's Deep Space Communication Array in 1983. The first entries were clinical, professional, daily reports on radio telescope operations, monitoring protocols, standard bureaucratic bullshit. But by 1985, the tone had changed. May 15th, 1985. Received transmission on frequency 14.7 GHz. Duration 17 minutes. Content: mathematical sequence, prime numbers, followed by what appears to be warning. Dr. Morrison wants to respond. I advised against it. June 3rd, 1985. Morrison sent response despite my objections. Used Arecibo dish to transmit back on same frequency. I have submitted formal complaint to Director Williams. June 20th, 1985. They're coming. The journal entries became increasingly erratic after that. Sketches of the container, technical diagrams for the locking mechanisms, and repeated references to something called the Beacon Protocol. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before Uncle Raymond's death. The seals are weakening. I can feel them pressing against the boundaries. When I die, Tommy will inherit the house. He's young, stubborn. He'll open it. God help us all. He'll open it, and they'll finally have their beacon. 9 locks remained closed. 8 nights until something arrived that had been traveling toward us for 40 years. The 4th lock opened while I was reading Uncle Raymond's journal upstairs. This time I felt it happen. A sharp pain behind my left eye, like someone had driven a nail through my skull. When the pain faded, I could hear something new in the basement's song. Harmonies that shouldn't exist, notes that human ears weren't designed to process. I knew I had to make contact with someone who understood what Raymond had been dealing with. The journal mentioned Dr. Morrison repeatedly, along with references to the Deep Space Communication Array. A quick internet search revealed the project had been disbanded in 1987, officially due to budget cuts, but several former team members were still alive. Dr. Alan Morrison lived in a retirement community outside Bend, Oregon, 3 hours' drive from Klamath Falls. I left that afternoon, locking the house behind me even though I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was in that container was beyond locked doors now. The Pine Valley Assisted Living Facility smelled like disinfectant and defeat. Dr. Morrison was 84, confined to a wheelchair, his mind sharp, but his body failing. When I mentioned Uncle Raymond's name, his face went pale. "Raymond Kolb," he whispered. "I wondered when someone would come asking about him." "You worked together at NASA?" "We worked together on the biggest mistake in human history." Morrison's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water. "Ray tried to stop me, tried to warn everyone. But I was young, arrogant. I thought I knew better." Morrison had kept his own records, hidden in a safety deposit box for 40 years. Files that NASA had ordered destroyed, transcripts of communications that had been classified above top secret. He made me promise to destroy everything after he told me, to never let anyone else know what they had unleashed. "We detected the first transmission in May of 1985, Morrison began. "Deep space, origin unknown, mathematical sequences that proved intelligence. Prime numbers, followed by geometric progressions, then something more complex. Binary code that translated to coordinates." "Coordinates for what?" "Earth's location." "They already knew where we were, Tommy. The transmission wasn't first contact. It was a test. They wanted to see if we were smart enough to stay quiet." Morrison opened a manila folder with trembling fingers. Inside were transcripts, technical diagrams, and photographs that made my stomach clench. Images of devices that looked disturbingly similar to Uncle Raymond's container. "When we responded to their transmission, we violated the most important law in the universe," Morrison continued. "Never answer a call you don't understand. Ray begged me not to send a response, said we were painting a target on our backs, but I was convinced we were making history. The response had been simple. Earth's coordinates sent back to the source, along with basic information about human civilization, population numbers, technological capabilities, biological composition. Everything a predator would need to hunt its prey." "The reply came 3 days later," Morrison said. "Not radio waves this time, physical delivery. 7 identical containers had materialized simultaneously at NASA facilities across the globe. No ships detected, no energy signatures, no explanation for how they had arrived. Each container bore the same warnings, the same locking mechanisms, the same warm metal that defied analysis. "We tried everything," Morrison explained. "X-rays, magnetic resonance, spectrographic analysis. The containers were impervious to every scanning method we had, but we could feel them changing, growing warmer, humming louder each day." NASA had distributed the containers to secure facilities, hoping isolation would contain whatever they represented. Uncle Raymond had volunteered to take one of them, to monitor it privately while maintaining his cover at the post office. The other 6 containers had been placed in underground bunkers, watched by teams of scientists who slowly, inevitably, went insane. "The first facility went dark in 1987, Morrison said. Cheyenne Mountain, 43 personnel, gone without a trace. The container was found open, empty, surrounded by symbols burned into the rock walls. Mathematical formulas that hurt to look at directly. One by one, the facilities had fallen silent. Teams would report the locks opening, describe the symbols appearing, transmit increasingly frantic messages about sounds in the walls, shadows moving where no shadows should exist. Then nothing. Ray's container was the last one, Morrison whispered. He kept it sealed longer than anyone else. 40 years of vigilance, 40 years of fighting whatever was trying to break free. but the seals were always temporary. We were just buying time. Time for what? Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a combination radio and Geiger counter. Time to build this, a detection array that Ray designed before he died. He called it the final protocol. The device was scanning for electromagnetic signatures that matched the container's energy output. According to its readings, 6 other locations across the globe were now broadcasting the same frequency as Uncle Raymond's basement. The containers were communicating with each other, coordinating something. They're not weapons, Morrison explained. They're beacons, signals to guide something here from deep space. Ray figured out that much before his first heart attack. Whatever sent these containers has been traveling toward us for 40 years, waiting for the beacons to activate. How long do we have? Morrison checked his device again. The readings had spiked since that morning. Based on the energy output, maybe 3 days, 4 at most. When all 17 locks open, the beacon will reach full power. And then, he trailed off, staring at the readouts. And then what? Then we find out what's been hunting us. I drove back to Klamath Falls as the sun set behind the Cascade Mountains. The device Morrison had given me chittered constantly, detecting energy pulses from the direction of Uncle Raymond's house. By the time I reached the turnoff to the property, the readings were off the charts. 8 more locks had opened while I was gone, only 6 remained sealed. The basement had transformed. The concrete walls were covered in symbols now. Mathematical equations that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air itself glowed with a faint blue phosphorescence that made my skin tingle. And the container was floating 3 inches above the floor, rotating slowly on an invisible axis. The humming had become a symphony, harmonies layered upon harmonies, melodies that suggested vast spaces between stars, songs of species that had never seen sunlight. It was beautiful and terrifying, like listening to the universe sing its own death march. I set up camp in Uncle Raymond's living room, surrounded by his journals, Morrison's files, and the detection device that now screamed warnings every few minutes. Through the floor, I could feel vibrations as the container spun faster, its remaining locks straining against whatever was building inside. Outside, the night was wrong. Stars that should have been steady points of light flickered like candles in wind. The moon appeared larger, closer, tinted with the same blue glow that filled the basement. Animals had fled the area entirely. Even insects had gone silent. At midnight, I tried calling Jake again. The phone rang once, then cut to static filled with voices speaking in languages that had never been human. When I hung up, the phone rang back immediately. No one spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. Breathing that came in rhythms no human lung could maintain. I unplugged the phone and threw it in a drawer. Morrison's detection device showed 6 other beacons reaching critical resonance around the globe. Coordinates in Siberia, Antarctica, the Sahara Desert, the ocean depths off Chile, somewhere in the Australian outback, and what appeared to be the middle of the Amazon rainforest. All of them broadcasting the same signal. All of them calling something home. I opened Uncle Raymond's journal to the final entries, looking for any hint about how to stop what was coming. Instead, I found a letter addressed to me, written in his careful handwriting. Tommy, if you're reading this, then I'm dead and the seals are failing. I'm sorry you inherited this burden. I tried to find another way, spent 40 years looking for a solution that didn't exist. The containers can't be destroyed or stopped. They're too far beyond our technology, our understanding. But maybe they can be redirected. Maybe someone young and desperate enough can find a way to send them home empty-handed. Check the workshop behind the house. I left you tools. 6 locks remained. According to Morrison's calculations, maybe 36 hours until whatever had been traveling toward us for 4 decades finally arrived. I had to find that workshop. The workshop sat hidden beneath 20 years of Oregon blackberry vines, so overgrown I almost missed it in the darkness. Uncle Raymond had built it to look like a storage shed from the outside, but when I finally hacked through the thorns and forced open the rusted door, I found something that looked more like a military bunker. The walls were lined with lead sheeting, thick enough to stop radiation or electromagnetic pulses. Banks of monitoring equipment hummed quietly in standby mode, their screens dark but ready. And covering every available surface were blueprints, technical drawings, and photographs, that made Morrison's files look like a child's science project. Uncle Raymond hadn't just been monitoring the container, he'd been reverse engineering it. 40 years of meticulous documentation covered the workshop walls. Spectral analysis charts showing energy frequencies that violated known physics, circuit diagrams for devices that shouldn't have been possible with Earth technology, and in the center of it all, a machine that looked like it had been built from equal parts NASA equipment and alien nightmares. The device stood 8 feet tall, constructed from materials I couldn't identify, metal that shifted color depending on the angle, crystals that pulsed with internal light, and a control interface covered in symbols that matched the ones appearing on the basement walls. A handwritten note was taped to the main console of Final Protocol Mark 7, field tested but never activated. If you're reading this, then the beacons are reaching critical resonance. This machine can theoretically disrupt their signals, but the power requirements are massive. It will drain the entire regional electrical grid and probably kill anyone within a mile radius. Use only as last resort. Raja King, a thick manual, sat beside the controls, Uncle Raymond's meticulous handwriting filling hundreds of pages. He had documented everything: the container's energy patterns, the mathematical sequences broadcast by the beacons, even psychological profiles of the research teams who had gone insane. But it was the final chapter that made my hands shake as I read. Project timeline analysis, critical observations. The entities responsible for the containers have been monitoring human technological development for at least 2 centuries. Telegraph transmissions from the 1800s contained embedded signals that we only detected in retrospect. Radio broadcasts from the 1920s were systematically analyzed and catalogued by unknown intelligence. Our response to their 1985 transmission wasn't first contact. It was the final examination. They have been testing us, measuring our aggression, our technology, our potential threat level. Every transmission we've sent into space, every satellite we've launched, every radio telescope we've built, all of it has been monitored, recorded, analyzed. The containers aren't invasion beacons, they're elimination signals. The next pages contained astronomical data that made my stomach drop. Uncle Raymond had spent decades mapping the locations of civilizations that had gone silent across the galaxy. Hundreds of star systems that had once broadcast radio signals, then stopped, always within a few decades of achieving deep space communication technology. We weren't the first species to receive the containers, we were just the latest. Behind the workshop, I found Uncle Raymond's telescope array, 6 dishes aimed at different sectors of the sky, all connected to recording equipment that had been running continuously for 40 years. The hard drives contained terabytes of data, radio transmissions from dead civilizations, mathematical proofs from species that no longer existed, final messages broadcast into the void by worlds that knew they were dying. The last recording had been made just 3 days ago, a transmission from somewhere in the direction of Vega, lasting 17 seconds. They came for us as they will come for you. The beacons cannot be stopped, but they can be redirected. Look for the resonance gap at frequency 14.7 gigahertz. Make them think you're already dead. Survive, learn, warn others. I played the recording 3 times before I understood what I was hearing. The voice was human, someone from Earth, broadcasting from deep space, trying to send a warning back home. How many of our people had they taken over the years? How many had been studying the hunters while pretending to be dead? Back in the basement, the 11th lock had opened. Only 6 remained sealed, and the container was spinning fast enough to create a visible vortex in the air around it. The symbols on the walls were moving now, equations solving themselves, formulas that described the geometry of space between dimensions. Morrison's detection device was screaming constantly. The other beacons around the globe had reached 97% power. Whatever was coming for us would arrive within hours. I activated Uncle Raymond's final protocol device, following the detailed startup procedures he'd documented. The machine came alive with sounds that hurt to hear, frequencies that made my bones ache and my vision blur. Power cables snaked from the workshop to the main electrical line, drawing energy from the entire regional grid. The plan was insane. Instead of trying to destroy the beacon, the final protocol would make it broadcast a different signal. Uncle Raymond had decoded the mathematical sequences used by dead civilizations, the specific frequencies that meant extinct in the hunters' communication system. If we could make Earth's beacon transmit those death codes, maybe the hunters would mark our world as already harvested and move on to other targets. But the deception had to be perfect. Any error in the signal would reveal the trick, and humanity would face something worse than extinction. We would face the systematic torture that Uncle Raymond had detected in the final transmissions from other worlds. As I prepared to activate the protocol, I found one more note hidden in the machine's control panel. "Tommy, I know you'll try to use this device because you're stubborn like your father, but you need to understand the cost. The final protocol doesn't just fake our extinction, it creates real quantum resonance with dead civilizations. Anyone operating the device will experience every death signal ever broadcast. You'll live through the final moments of hundreds of species. Most humans can't survive that kind of psychic trauma. I couldn't do it myself. Too old, too weak. But maybe someone young enough, someone with nothing left to lose, can endure it long enough to complete the transmission. I'm sorry I had to leave this choice to you. Uncle Raymond." 13 locks had opened while I read the note. The container was now spinning so fast it appeared stationary, surrounded by a sphere of blue energy that made the air itself sing. Through the basement windows, I could see the sky changing. Stars were disappearing one by one, replaced by something vast and dark that blotted out entire constellations. The hunters had arrived. I could feel them out there beyond the atmosphere, waiting for the final locks to open. Ships the size of continents, minds older than human civilization, weapons that could unravel the quantum structure of matter itself. They had done this before hundreds of times, perfecting their harvesting techniques on species after species. But Uncle Raymond had given me a chance, one desperate, probably suicidal chance to save what was left of humanity. I returned to the workshop and began the final protocol initialization sequence. The machine responded by scanning my nervous system, measuring my psychological profile, determining whether I could survive the process. Uncle Raymond had programmed it to reject anyone who wasn't mentally prepared for what was coming. After 30 seconds, the machine accepted me. Green lights cascaded across the control panel, and I felt something probe the inside of my skull, mapping my brain patterns, preparing to link my consciousness with the quantum communication network that connected every beacon across the galaxy. Through that network, I would experience the death of civilizations. I would feel what it was like to watch your homeworld burn, to see your species enslaved, to know that everything you had ever loved was being systematically destroyed by entities that viewed genocide as routine maintenance. But maybe, if I could endure it long enough, I could broadcast the right codes, make them think Earth was already dead, buy humanity time to learn, to prepare, to find a way to fight back. 15 locks had opened, 2 remained. Outside, the darkness between stars was descending toward Earth like a living thing, tentacles of shadow reaching through the atmosphere, tasting our world, preparing to feed. I placed my hands on the final protocol controls and felt the machine link with my nervous system. Pain exploded through my skull as my consciousness merged with the beacon network, and suddenly I was no longer alone in my head. Voices from 1,000 dead worlds began speaking at once, sharing their final moments, their terror, their desperate hope that someone, somewhere would survive long enough to remember they had existed. The 16th lock opened with a sound like reality tearing. 1 lock remained. Through the quantum link, I could feel the hunter's attention turning toward Earth. Ancient minds, vast and cold, calculating how best to harvest our planet, how to extract maximum resources while minimizing damage to useful infrastructure. They had done this so many times before. We were just another farm ready for harvest. But as the final lock began to turn, I started broadcasting the death codes. Frequencies that screamed of extinction, mathematical proofs of annihilation, quantum signatures that labeled Earth as already consumed. The lie had to be perfect. The hunters had to believe that someone else had reached our world first, that humanity was already gone, that Earth held nothing worth taking. In my mind, I felt the probe signals from their ships sweep across the planet, searching for signs of life, for the electromagnetic signatures of civilization. Uncle Raymond's final protocol was masking everything, making our cities look like ruins, our radio transmissions appear as background radiation, our technology seem like archaeological remnants. But the deception required a sacrifice. To make the death codes authentic, someone had to die broadcasting them. Someone had to actually experience extinction while transmitting the signal. The final lock opened and the container's lid lifted with a hiss of escaping gas that smelled like ozone and burning copper. Inside was nothing but darkness, a perfect sphere of absolute void that seemed to draw light into itself and devour it. And from that darkness, something began to emerge. What emerged from the darkness wasn't a creature or a weapon. It was a person. A man in a NASA jumpsuit, pale and trembling, blinking as if he'd been asleep for decades. He looked maybe 35, with greying hair and calloused hands, and when he saw me, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, then absolute terror. "Tommy?" His voice was rough, unused. "Jesus Christ, you opened it. You actually opened it." I knew that voice. I'd heard it on old home videos, family gatherings from when I was a kid, but it was impossible. The man standing in front of me had been dead for 3 years. "Dad?" James Kolb stepped out of the container on shaking legs, and I could see through him, not completely transparent, but like a double exposure photograph. Real enough to cast shadows, solid enough to stumble against the basement wall, but wrong in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on him. "They took me in 1987, he said, touching his face as if surprised to find it still there. "Right after Ray called me about the container, I was working late at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory when the walls just opened. No doors, no passages. The walls became space, and things reached through and pulled me out of reality. The final protocol was still active, my mind linked to the quantum network, and through that connection, I could feel my father's memories. Not see them, feel them, experience them like they were my own thoughts. Decades aboard ships that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Laboratories where captured humans were studied, dissected, rebuilt, holding cells that contained specimens from hundreds of worlds, all of them slowly going insane from isolation and hopelessness. They've been harvesting us for 40 years, Dad continued, his translucent hands gesturing at nothing. Taking people one at a time, learning everything about human biology, psychology, technology, building a database of our weaknesses. Through the quantum link, I felt the probe signals from the hunters' ships intensify. They had detected the opened container, sensed the presence of one of their specimens. The death codes I was broadcasting were working. Earth's electromagnetic signature was being masked, our cities appearing dead to their scanners, but they knew something was wrong. "Tommy, you have to shut down the protocol," Dad said. "They'll trace the signal back to its source. When they find you operating that machine, they'll know the extinction is fake. But if I stop, they'll detect human civilization. They'll know we're still alive. They already know." Dad moved closer, and I could smell something on him like ozone and copper, the same smell that had escaped from the container. "The specimens they've been taking, we've been sending information back. Coded transmissions hidden in quantum static. Other worlds have tried the fake extinction gambit before. The hunters learned to watch for it." Outside, the darkness between stars was descending faster now, tentacles of shadow reaching through the atmosphere like fingers testing bathwater. Morrison's detection device was screaming warnings as the other beacons around the globe reached 100% power output. "Then what's the point?" I asked. "Why did Uncle Raymond build this machine if it can't save us?" Dad's semi-transparent face smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like I remembered from childhood. "Because the final protocol was never meant to fake our extinction. It was meant to fake something else entirely." He gestured at the basement walls, where Uncle Raymond's equations were still shifting and changing, solving mathematical problems that hurt to look at directly. "Ray figured out what the hunters really are. They're not aliens from another planet, they're us. Humans from a timeline where we became the galactic predators." The quantum link in my head exploded with new information. Images of parallel universes where humanity had developed differently. Timelines where we had achieved faster than light travel, not through exploration, but through conquest. Realities where human civilization had become a species-consuming plague that swept across the galaxy. Every world they harvest provides resources for the next invasion, Dad explained. They strip mine civilizations to fuel their expansion into adjacent timelines. Our Earth isn't unique. It's just another iteration in an infinite series of harvests. So we can't fight them because they're us. We can't fight them because they know exactly how we think, how we'll react, what our strategies will be. They've harvested hundreds of versions of Earth. They know our tactics before we develop them. But there was something else in the quantum link. Information that Dad was trying to hide from me, memories he didn't want me to access. I pushed deeper into the network, following data streams that led to sources he couldn't protect. Uncle Raymond had discovered more than just the hunter's identity. He had found a way to corrupt their timeline. The final protocol doesn't fake extinction, I said, understanding flooding through me. It creates it. It sends a quantum virus back through the network to their reality, to the first Earth that became the hunters. Dad's expression changed. Tommy, you don't understand the cost. But I did understand. Through the quantum link, I could see the virus Uncle Raymond had designed. A mathematical cancer that would spread through the hunter's timeline, unraveling the quantum foundations that allowed them to exist across multiple realities. It would kill them, but it would also kill every version of humanity they had ever harvested. Billions of humans across thousands of timelines would die in order to stop the hunters from reaching billions more. The virus needs a human consciousness to carry it, Dad said. Someone has to guide it through the quantum network, target it at the right reality, make sure it reaches its destination. But the process burns out the carrier's mind. Whoever activates it won't survive to see if it works. Through the basement windows, I could see the hunters' ships breaking through the cloud cover. Vast structures that bent light around themselves, making the sky appear to fold inward. They had stopped believing in Earth's extinction. Probe beams were scanning the surface, looking for the source of the fake death signals. There has to be another way, I said. There is. Dad pointed at the container. I can carry the virus. I'm already dead, existing in quantum superposition between realities. I can guide it to the hunter's timeline without risking a living human consciousness. But you'll be destroyed in the process. I've been dead for 3 years, son. This is just making it official. The probe beams had found Klamath Falls. I could feel them scanning the house, penetrating the lead shielding in the workshop, detecting the final protocol device. In minutes, they would trace the signal to its source and realize the extinction was fake. Dad stepped toward the container, his translucent form beginning to glow with the same blue energy that surrounded the basement. Tell me about your life, he said. The last 3 years. I want to know what I missed. So as the hunters' ships descended toward Earth, as their probe beams carved through the atmosphere and their weapons charged to sterilize human civilization, I told my dead father about college, about my job at the auto shop in Portland, about the girlfriend who had left me, about the dreams I'd had of becoming something more than just another small-town mechanic. I'm proud of you, he said when I finished. You turned out better than I hoped. The quantum virus was ready. Uncle Raymond's mathematical cancer, designed to unravel the foundations of reality itself, waited for a consciousness brave enough to guide it home. Dad stepped into the container and smiled. Take care of Ray's house. He always wanted it to stay in the family. Then he was gone, pulled into the quantum network, carrying death toward an alternate reality where humans had become monsters. The hunters' ships reached the surface just as their timeline began to collapse. Through the quantum link, I felt their confusion as the virus spread through their reality, unraveling the mathematical structures that held their existence together, felt their panic as they realized what was happening, their desperate attempts to sever the connection between dimensions. But it was too late. Uncle Raymond's virus had reached its target, and the hunter's timeline was dissolving like sugar in rain. Above me, their ships began to flicker in and out of existence. One moment they were solid enough to cast shadows, the next they were ghost images fading from reality. The quantum link went silent. The beacon stopped humming, and in the basement, Uncle Raymond's container sealed itself with a sound like a door slamming shut. But I could still feel the virus working, not just in the Hunter's timeline, but in ours. Uncle Raymond's mathematical cancer was spreading through the quantum foundations of reality itself. The Hunter's ships didn't just disappear, they collapsed inward on themselves, folding through dimensions I couldn't name, leaving tears in the sky that bled starlight. Through the quantum link, I felt their final moments, the confusion, the rage, the absolute terror of beings who had thought themselves immortal suddenly facing extinction. But the virus wasn't finished. Uncle Raymond's mathematical cancer had been designed to target the specific quantum signatures that allowed consciousness to exist across multiple timelines. It was supposed to destroy only the Hunters and their harvested specimens. Instead, it was spreading like wildfire through the entire network of parallel realities. I could feel other versions of myself dying. Tommies who had never found the container, who had lived normal lives in peaceful timelines. Tommies who had become scientists, artists, fathers. Each death hit me like a physical blow, their final thoughts merging with mine before cutting off abruptly. The basement around me began to shift. Reality was becoming unstable, quantum foundations cracking under the virus's assault. The walls flickered between concrete and metal, between Uncle Raymond's house and laboratories I'd never seen. Sometimes I was standing in the basement, sometimes I was floating in space, sometimes I was drowning in an ocean of liquid mathematics. Morrison's detection device exploded in a shower of sparks and molten metal. The final protocol machine began smoking, its alien components overloading as it tried to process data from collapsing timelines. And through it all, Uncle Raymond's equations on the walls continued solving themselves, faster and faster, until they were just blurs of light racing across the concrete. I tried to disconnect from the quantum link, but it was too late. The virus had integrated with my consciousness, using my mind as a relay point to reach deeper into the network. Every parallel reality it destroyed fed more power back through the connection, accelerating its spread exponentially. Through the chaos, I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Jake appeared at the bottom of the steps, but not the Jake I knew. This one was older, scarred, wearing military fatigues and carrying weapons I didn't recognize. Behind him came another version of myself. This Tommy was missing his left arm and had tattoos covering half his face. "You fucking idiot," the alternate Tommy said. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "The virus was supposed to target only the Hunters," I protested. "The virus can't tell the difference between Hunter consciousness and human consciousness," Jake said. He was checking readings on a device that looked like Morrison's detector, but more advanced. In their timeline, we became the Hunters. Same quantum signatures, same psychological patterns. Uncle Raymond knew this would happen. The alternate Tommy grabbed me by the shirt with his remaining hand. Ray designed the virus to destroy every version of humanity across all timelines. He called it the final solution, kill everyone so no one could ever become the Hunters. But that's genocide on a cosmic scale. "Yeah," Jake said, "and it's already 70% complete." More versions of us kept arriving through tears in reality. A Tommy who was a priest, his eyes burning with religious fervor as he explained how the virus was God's judgment on a species too dangerous to exist. A Jake who had become a quantum physicist, frantically calculating ways to reverse the process while reality collapsed around us. They were all refugees from dying timelines, fleeing the virus's advance through a network of realities that was rapidly shrinking. "There might be a way to stop it," the physicist Jake said, his fingers flying over calculations that hung in the air like holographic equations. "But we need to reach the source timeline, the original reality where Uncle Raymond created the virus." "How do we find it?" I asked. "We follow the quantum wake," the priest Tommy said. "Every reality the virus destroys leaves a signature pointing back to its origin. But the journey will kill most of us. Only one or two might survive to reach the source." The basement around us was becoming increasingly unstable. Parts of the wall showed Uncle Raymond's workshop. Other parts revealed alien laboratories where human specimens were being dissected. Sometimes I could see through the floor to bottomless voids filled with screaming mathematics. "We need to move now," the scarred Tommy said. "This timeline has maybe 10 minutes before complete collapse." But as we prepared to jump to the next reality, something went wrong. The quantum link that connected us to the network began feeding back on itself, creating a resonance loop that trapped us between dimensions. We were stuck in a reality that was half collapsed, existing in the mathematical space between timelines. Through the chaos, I heard another voice, Uncle Raymond's voice, speaking from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm sorry, boys, I didn't want it to come to this." He materialized in the basement, but not as I remembered him. This Uncle Raymond was younger, maybe 40, wearing a NASA lab coat over clothes from the 1980s. His eyes held the weight of someone who had seen the future and chosen to destroy it. "You're from the source timeline," the physicist Jake said. "The original reality where the virus was created." "I've been watching all of you struggle against the inevitable," Uncle Raymond said. "Every version of humanity eventually becomes the hunters. Every timeline where we survive long enough to achieve faster-than-light travel ends with us consuming other species. It's our nature. We're predators." "So you decided to commit universal genocide," the priest Tommy said. "I decided to prevent infinite genocide. How many species would we have destroyed if I'd let us spread across the galaxy? How many worlds would we have harvested if I'd allowed human civilization to continue its expansion?" The alternate versions of us were beginning to fade as the resonance loop destabilized. Reality was eating itself, quantum foundations collapsing faster than they could be replaced. "There has to be another way," I said. "Some timeline where humanity learns to be better." Uncle Raymond's expression softened slightly. "I searched for 40 years, mapped 10,000 realities. In every single timeline where humanity survives to reach the stars, we become the hunters. Every single one." But the physicist Jake was still working on his equations, calculating probabilities at speeds that made my head spin. "Wait," he said suddenly. "There's an anomaly in the quantum signature data, a timeline that's been isolated from the network since 1985. "Impossible," Uncle Raymond said. "The virus has reached every connected reality. This one isn't connected. It was deliberately severed from the network right after the first contact transmission. Someone in that timeline found a way to break the quantum link entirely." Uncle Raymond's face went pale. "That shouldn't be possible. The connection is built into the fundamental structure of space-time itself." "Unless someone changed the fundamental structure," Jake said, "modified the quantum constants that govern reality itself." Through the collapsing basement, we could feel the virus reaching the final 5% of accessible timelines. Soon, there would be nothing left but empty mathematics, where infinite versions of humanity had once existed. "I can send one person to the isolated timeline," Jake said, "but the process will use the last of the quantum energy holding this pocket dimension together. Whoever goes won't be able to return." "I'll go," I said immediately. "No," the priest Tommy said. "It should be someone who understands the technical aspects, someone who can figure out how they broke the quantum link." "It should be someone who's already dead," the alternate Tommy said. "Someone who won't create paradoxes by existing in a timeline where they might meet themselves." Uncle Raymond stepped forward. "It should be me. This is my responsibility. I created the virus. I should be the one to find an alternative solution." But before any of us could move, the quantum resonance loop collapsed entirely. The basement, the house, the entire pocket dimension began falling apart at the molecular level. Through the chaos, I saw Jake preparing to send someone to the isolated timeline. "The coordinates are locked in," he shouted over the sound of reality tearing itself apart. "But I can only send one person, and they have to go now." That's when the scarred Tommy grabbed Uncle Raymond and shoved him toward the quantum rift Jake had opened. "Go! Find a way to stop this." But Uncle Raymond fought back, and in the struggle, both of them tumbled through the portal together. The rift collapsed immediately, using the last of the available quantum energy. The priest Tommy, the physicist Jake, the alternate versions of myself, they all began dissolving as the pocket dimension finally collapsed. Their final words were warnings about what I would find in the isolated timeline, instructions on how to use the quantum technology, desperate prayers that someone would remember the species we had been before we became monsters. Then I was alone in a basement that no longer existed, floating in mathematical space between realities that were dying faster than I could count them. The virus had reached 98% completion. In a few minutes, every version of humanity across the infinite multiverse would be extinct. But somewhere out there was a timeline that had found another way, a reality where humans had broken free from the quantum network entirely, where they had chosen isolation over expansion, survival over conquest. I had to find them, had to learn how they had escaped the cycle that made us into hunters. Using the last fragments of the quantum link, I began tracing the signature Jake had detected, following a trail of severed connections back to a timeline that had deliberately chosen to be alone. A timeline where humanity might have learned to be something other than predators. As the virus consumed the final 2% of accessible realities, I jumped through quantum space toward the only Earth that might still have answers. The only Earth that might still have hope. The isolated timeline felt wrong from the moment I arrived. I materialized in what should have been Uncle Raymond's basement, but the house above was different, older. The foundation stones were hand-cut granite instead of poured concrete, and the walls bore scorch marks that looked decades old. But most disturbing was the silence, complete absence of the quantum humming that had become the soundtrack to my existence. This reality had been severed from the network so thoroughly that even basic quantum interactions felt muted, dampened, like trying to breathe underwater. I climbed the basement stairs into a house that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The layout matched Uncle Raymond's place, but the furnishings belonged to a different era. Hand-carved furniture from the 1800s, oil lamps instead of electric lights, and photographs on the walls showing people in clothes I didn't recognize. But the faces in those photographs were faces I knew. Uncle Raymond, but younger, and wearing what looked like a Union Army uniform. My father as a child, standing next to a woman who could have been my grandmother if my grandmother had lived in the 1860s. On the mantel, a daguerreotype showed my own face staring back at me from beneath a frontier hat. "You're not the first to arrive," a voice said behind me. I spun around to find an old man sitting in Uncle Raymond's chair, except it wasn't Uncle Raymond's chair, it was an antique rocker that probably predated electricity. The man was ancient, maybe 90, with white hair and eyes that held the depth of someone who had seen too much. But I recognized the bone structure, the way he held his shoulders. This was Uncle Raymond, aged beyond anything I'd seen in my timeline. "You're from the source reality," he said. "The one where the virus was created. I can smell the quantum decay on you. How did you know I was coming?" "Because you've been arriving for the past 130 years. He gestured at a wall covered with photographs, all showing the same scene. Various versions of myself materializing in this basement, some wearing modern clothes, others dressed like pioneers, a few in what looked like spacesuits from futures that would never exist. Every time a timeline collapsed, a few refugees made it here before the end. You're just the latest." I studied the photographs more carefully. Some of the Tommies looked exactly like me. Others were different, older, younger, scarred, missing limbs. But all of them had the same desperate expression, the same haunted eyes of someone who had watched reality collapse around them. "What happens to them?" I asked. "They integrate," Uncle Raymond said. "This timeline, it's different. Time doesn't flow linearly here. Past and future exist simultaneously. When refugees arrive, they don't replace the local versions of themselves. They merge with them. All timelines become one timeline." He stood slowly, joints creaking like old wood, and led me to a window that looked out over land that should have been Oregon forest. Instead, I saw a landscape that belonged to multiple time periods at once. Covered wagons rolled down roads that were simultaneously dirt paths and paved highways. Log cabins sat next to structures that looked like they belonged in the 23rd century. "How is this possible?" "Dr. Morrison figured it out in 1885, Uncle Raymond explained. "This timeline's Morrison, not yours. When the first transmission arrived from deep space, he realized what it meant. Instead of responding, he spent 5 years developing a way to sever our reality from the quantum network entirely." We walked outside, and I could see the impossible geography more clearly. Time had become flexible here, layers of history existing simultaneously. I watched a man in frontier clothes talking to someone wearing what looked like a NASA jumpsuit from the year 2150. Morrison's solution required a sacrifice, Uncle Raymond continued. He had to anchor this timeline to a single point in space-time, preventing it from connecting to any parallel realities. But the anchor had to be biological. It had to be human consciousness. Someone had to stay connected to all the timelines that were being severed. Someone had to become the focal point for every possible version of this reality. Every Tommy who might have existed, every Jake who could have been born, every version of humanity that might have developed here. We reached the center of the settlement, where a massive structure stood that definitely hadn't existed in my timeline. It looked like a combination of church, laboratory, and astronomical observatory, built from materials that shifted between wood, stone, and metals that didn't belong on Earth. Inside, I found them. Hundreds of versions of people I knew, all existing in the same space without conflict. Jakes from every possible timeline, all slightly different, but recognizably the same person. Tommies who had lived different lives, made different choices, become different people. Uncle Raymond's spanning ages from 20 to 90, representing every path his life might have taken. And at the center, connected to machinery that looked like a combination of 19th century clockwork and advanced quantum computers, was Dr. Morrison. All possible versions of Dr. Morrison, existing as a single consciousness that anchored the entire timeline to this isolated pocket of reality. "He's been holding us here for 140 years, Uncle Raymond said, preventing this timeline from connecting to the network, keeping us safe from the virus, but also keeping us trapped in a single moment of space-time." Morrison looked up as we approached, and I could see the strain in his eyes. The weight of maintaining the anchor was destroying him slowly, but he couldn't let go without allowing the timeline to reconnect to the network. "Another refugee," he said, his voice echoing with harmonics from multiple realities. "How many timelines are left?" "Maybe a dozen," I told him. "The virus has consumed everything else." Morrison's multiple selves exchanged glances that transcended normal communication. "Then it's time," they said in unison. "Time for what?" "To release the anchor," Uncle Raymond explained. "Morrison has been holding this timeline in isolation, but he's also been preparing. Learning from every refugee who arrived, studying their experiences, developing a counter-virus that can spread through the network and repair the damage. But I could see the problem immediately. If you release the anchor, this timeline will reconnect to the network. The virus will reach here in seconds. "Unless we can deploy the counter-virus fast enough," Morrison said. "We need someone who's still connected to the quantum network, someone who can carry the repair codes to the source timeline and implement them before the virus completes its cycle." He was looking at me. All versions of him were looking at me. "You're still linked to the network because you arrived here so recently," Uncle Raymond said. "The quantum decay hasn't been neutralized yet. If you carry the counter-virus back to the source timeline, you might be able to reverse the process." "Might?" "The counter-virus will try to reconstruct the destroyed timelines using your memories as templates," Morrison explained. "But human memory is imperfect. The reconstructed realities will be approximations, not exact copies. Billions of people will be restored to life, but they won't be precisely the same people who died. And there's no guarantee you'll survive the process," Uncle Raymond added. "Carrying the counter-virus through collapsing quantum space will burn out your consciousness faster than the original virus did to the hunters." Through the windows of the structure, I could see the landscape changing. The temporal layers were becoming unstable as Morrison prepared to release the anchor. Past and future were starting to separate. Multiple time periods pulling apart like layers of an onion. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the timeline becomes too unstable to maintain the counter-virus," Morrison said. "You need to decide now." I thought about all the versions of humanity that the virus had destroyed, the infinite possibilities that had been reduced to mathematical nothing, the chance that some approximation of those lives could be restored, even if they weren't perfect copies. What exactly would I have to do? Merge your consciousness with the counter-virus and carry it through the quantum network to the source timeline, Morrison explained. Find the original virus code that Uncle Raymond created and overwrite it with repair instructions. But the source timeline might have been destroyed already. The source timeline exists outside normal space-time, Uncle Raymond said. It's the mathematical foundation that supports all other realities. If you can reach it, you can access the viral code before it finishes executing. The settlement around us was beginning to blur as temporal layers separated completely. I could see covered wagons from the 1800s rolling through the same space occupied by buildings from the 2200s, all existing simultaneously but no longer anchored to the same moment. If I do this, and it works, what happens to this timeline? We rejoin the network, Morrison said, become part of the restored multiverse. But we'll remember everything, all the timelines that died, all the versions of humanity that were lost. We'll carry that knowledge forward to prevent it from happening again. Through the chaos of separating time periods, I could feel the original virus stirring at the edges of my consciousness. The quantum decay was accelerating as the timeline's isolation began to break down. Morrison was already preparing the countervirus, encoding repair instructions into mathematical structures that hurt to look at directly. The process was burning through his consciousness like acid, aging all versions of him simultaneously. "I need an answer," he said, his multiple voices becoming strained. "The anchor is failing." Outside, reality was coming apart. The past was trying to separate from the future, creating temporal shears that tore through the landscape like invisible knives. I placed my hand on the counter-virus interface and felt the repair codes integrate with my nervous system. The sensation was like having every nerve ending set on fire while simultaneously being frozen in liquid nitrogen. "Send me back," I said. "Let's bring them home." The journey back through quantum space was like being torn apart and rebuilt 1,000 times per second. Morrison's counter-virus had integrated so deeply with my consciousness that I couldn't tell where my thoughts ended and the repair codes began. Every memory I'd ever formed was being catalogued, analysed, prepared for use as a template to reconstruct the destroyed timelines. But the quantum network was collapsing faster than I could navigate it. Whole sections of mathematical space had been eaten away by Uncle Raymond's virus, leaving voids where infinite realities had once existed. I had to jump across gaps in logic itself, using fragments of destroyed physics to reach spaces that no longer technically existed. The source timeline appeared ahead of me like a lighthouse in an ocean of mathematical nothing. It existed at the foundation of all realities, a single point of absolute truth from which every parallel universe derived its basic structure. And it was dying. Uncle Raymond's virus had reached the core code, the fundamental equations that defined what it meant to be human across infinite possibilities. I could see the infection spreading through the mathematical DNA of consciousness itself, systematically deleting every pattern that could lead to intelligence, curiosity, exploration. I materialized in a laboratory that looked like NASA's deep space facility, but wrong. The walls were covered with equations that moved and shifted, solving problems about the nature of reality itself. Banks of computers hummed with calculations that violated every known law of physics. And sitting at the central console, typing code that would eliminate every trace of humanity from the multiverse, was Uncle Raymond. Not the old man I remembered, not the ancient version from the isolated timeline, but the Uncle Raymond from 1985 who had first decoded the Hunter's transmissions. "You're too late," he said without turning around. "The virus is 99.7% complete. In 30 seconds, every possible version of human consciousness will be extinct." "I brought a counter-virus. We can reverse this." Uncle Raymond finally looked at me and I saw madness in his eyes. 40 years of monitoring the container, of watching other species die, of knowing that humanity would inevitably become the Hunters, had broken something fundamental in his mind. "You don't understand," he said. "I've seen what we become. Every timeline, every possibility, every choice we could make leads to the same outcome. We become predators. We consume other species. We turn the galaxy into a slaughterhouse." The isolated timeline found another way. They severed themselves from the network, chose isolation over expansion. "Isolation isn't survival." Uncle Raymond slammed his fist on the console. "It's just slow death. A species that doesn't grow, doesn't explore, doesn't expand across the stars will eventually die anyway. At least this way we don't take anyone else with us. The virus code was nearing completion. I could feel it reaching into the deepest layers of the quantum foundation, preparing to delete the very concept of human consciousness from the mathematical structure of reality. I tried to access the central console, but Uncle Raymond had locked it down with security protocols that required his biometric signature. Only he could stop the virus, and he was determined to see humanity extinct. "Look at them," he said, gesturing at screens that showed the hunters' final moments across thousands of timelines. "Look at what we became. They were us, Tommy. Every single one of them was a human being who decided that their survival mattered more than anyone else's. But through the counter-virus interface, I could access Morrison's memories from the isolated timeline. Decades of watching different versions of humanity coexist peacefully, working together instead of competing, choosing cooperation over conquest. That wasn't inevitable, I said. It was just one possible path. It was the only path that worked. Every other choice led to disaster. The virus reached 99.9% completion. Seconds remained before it would delete the final traces of human consciousness from reality. I did the only thing I could think of. I merged my consciousness directly with the counter-virus and launched it at Uncle Raymond's mind, forcing him to experience Morrison's memories from the isolated timeline, showing him the versions of humanity that had learned to be better. For a moment, Uncle Raymond's expression changed. He saw the covered wagons rolling peacefully alongside spaceships, the different versions of himself working together instead of fighting, the possibility that humanity could choose wisdom over conquest. But the virus was already executing its final commands. "Even if you're right," Uncle Raymond said, "it's too late to stop this. The deletion protocols are hard-coded into the quantum foundation. Nothing can reverse them now." Then we rebuild from scratch. I disconnected the counter-virus from my consciousness and injected it directly into the quantum foundation itself. Instead of trying to stop Uncle Raymond's virus, Morrison's repair codes began constructing new mathematical frameworks alongside the old ones, creating parallel structures that could support consciousness even after the original patterns were deleted. The process was like performing surgery on the concept of existence itself. Uncle Raymond watched in horror as the counter-virus began reconstructing the deleted timelines. Not perfect copies, but approximations based on my memories and the experiences of every refugee who had reached the isolated timeline. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "Those reconstructed realities won't be stable. They'll collapse within decades. Then we'll have decades to find a better solution." But I could feel the counter-virus burning through my consciousness, using my neural patterns as raw material for the reconstruction process. Each timeline it restored took pieces of my memory, my personality, my sense of self. The isolation protocol that Morrison had developed was also integrating with the repair codes. As each timeline was restored, it would be given the choice to sever itself from the quantum network, to choose isolation over expansion, to learn from the mistakes that had led to this moment. Uncle Raymond's virus reached 100% completion, deleting the final traces of the original human consciousness from reality. For a moment, the multiverse was empty of intelligence, empty of curiosity, empty of the spark that made humans more than just biological machines. Then Morrison's counter-virus activated. Reality exploded back into existence like a big bang in reverse. Timelines reconstructed themselves from mathematical fragments, consciousness patterns rebuilt from scattered data, entire civilizations restored to life by algorithms that had learned from their destruction. But the restored realities were different. Each one received Morrison's isolation protocol, the knowledge of what had happened, the understanding that expansion and conquest led only to extinction. Most chose to sever themselves from the quantum network immediately, preferring solitude to the risk of becoming hunters. A few chose differently. They remained connected but established strict protocols for contact with other species, creating networks of cooperation instead of conquest. These timelines would serve as bridges between isolated realities, carrying knowledge and culture without the virus of predatory expansion. Through the reconstruction process, I could feel myself fragmenting. Parts of my consciousness were being used to template the restored Tommy Kolbs across thousands of timelines. Other fragments became the foundation for ethical frameworks that would guide humanity's development in directions that didn't lead to galactic genocide. Uncle Raymond was experiencing the same fragmentation, his knowledge of the hunter's methods being converted into warnings and safeguards built into the quantum foundation itself. Future versions of humanity would carry the memory of what they could become, but also the wisdom to choose differently. "It's not perfect," I said to him as we both began to dissolve into the repair codes, "but it's better than nothing." "How do you know they won't make the same mistakes again?" "Because they'll remember every timeline we've restored carries the memory of this moment, of the choice between extinction and wisdom." Uncle Raymond's expression softened as his consciousness merged with the counter-virus. "I hope you're right. I hope they're strong enough to choose better than we did." The source timeline began to stabilize as the reconstruction process completed. The mathematical foundation had been rebuilt with safeguards against viral consciousness, protections against the kind of cascading deletion that had nearly destroyed everything. But the cost was everything we had been. Our individual consciousnesses were scattered across infinite realities, our memories and personalities used as building blocks for better versions of humanity. I felt myself dissolving into the quantum foundation, becoming part of the mathematical structure that would guide humanity's development across the restored multiverse. My last coherent thought was a hope that the people we had saved would be wise enough to avoid the mistakes that had led to this moment. That they would choose cooperation over conquest, wisdom over power, survival over supremacy. The source timeline sealed itself, becoming the eternal foundation for a multiverse where humanity had learned, finally, to be something other than hunters. But whether that lesson would last forever, only time would tell. The first thing you notice about the dreams is how real they feel. I wake up most mornings with the taste of copper in my mouth and memories that don't belong to me. Images of a basement in Klamath Falls, a man named Tommy standing over a container that hummed with impossible frequencies. Sometimes I remember being him, remember the weight of choosing between extinction and hope. My name is David Chen and I'm nobody special. Work at a tire shop in Sacramento, live alone, spend weekends fishing in the Delta. Normal life, normal problems, except for the dreams that feel more like borrowed memories. The psychiatrist says it's trauma response to something my brain can't process. Post-stress syndrome from an event that never technically happened to me. She prescribes pills that don't help and suggests meditation techniques that make the dreams worse. What she doesn't know is that sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can feel mathematics moving behind my eyes. Equations that solve themselves, formulas that describe the spaces between realities. Knowledge that belongs to a Tommy Kolb who died saving everyone and no one at the same time. The internet helps sometimes. Forums where people share similar experiences. A woman in Manitoba who dreams about operating quantum machinery. A man in Australia who wakes up with technical specifications for devices that don't exist. A kid in Norway who draws blueprints for spacecraft designed to never leave their home system. We call ourselves the inheritors. Sounds dramatic, but it fits. We inherited fragments of consciousness from people who made impossible choices in timelines that collapsed and rebuilt themselves. Most of us don't believe our own memories. Easier to think we're just crazy. But sometimes, late at night when the dreams are particularly vivid, I drive out to places that feel familiar. Abandoned NASA facilities where grass grows through cracked parking lots. Radio telescope arrays that were shut down in the 1980s for reasons nobody wants to discuss. Government buildings with basements that were sealed and forgotten. Last month, I found a house in Oregon that matched the layout from my dreams. Same foundation stones, same view of the mountains, same feeling of wrongness that made my teeth ache when I got too close. The current owners said weird things happened there sometimes. Electronics malfunctioned, animals avoided the property. People reported hearing humming sounds from the basement. They were happy to sell it cheap. I spent 3 weeks digging through that basement, following memories that might have been hallucinations. Found nothing but old concrete and forgotten wiring. But on the last night, just before I gave up, I heard it. Faint but unmistakable. Humming, not from the basement, but from somewhere deeper. somewhere that existed in the mathematical spaces between real and unreal. The sound of consciousness echoing across dimensions, carrying warnings from people who had already paid the price for humanity's survival. I sealed the basement with concrete and left. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Some doors should stay closed, even when they're already open. But I kept the key because the dreams are getting stronger, and sometimes they show me things that haven't happened yet. Ships descending from spaces between stars. Containers arriving at coordinates that were broadcast 40 years ago. Warnings that travel faster than light but always arrive too late. Humanity learned to choose isolation over expansion, wisdom over conquest. Most of the timelines that were reconstructed stayed separate, developing in their own quiet corners of reality. We became gardeners instead of hunters, teachers instead of predators. But the universe is vast, and we weren't the only species to make contact with something hungry in the dark. The dreams show me other worlds, other containers, other last chances that arrive just in time to be too late. And sometimes when the humming gets loud enough, I can feel them calling for help across distances that don't exist in any mathematics we understand. The next phase is beginning, and this time we might actually be ready for it.